So I finally read through the 12 Rules by Jordan Peterson, and a lot of people have been asking me to comment either on this book or on Jordan Peterson in general, and I haven't really wanted to do that until I had a chance to read his work myself. Now, I'll say this going in, I am not an expert on Jordan Peterson. I haven't really watched a lot of his YouTube videos or his lectures, but I did read this one book, and so I can give you my thoughts on it, some of what I thought was helpful in it, and some of what I thought needs to be critiqued and balanced out a little bit. So first of all, there are a couple core ideas that really seem to drive Jordan Peterson's philosophy. And the first is that he sees everything, and I mean everything, through an evolutionary lens. So not just our biology, but our psychology, our sociology, all of the structures that we have built as a society, he sees all of that as the culmination of a survival of the fittest mechanism that has brought us to this point. And because of that, he sees whatever has been or whatever has survived, whatever is old, whatever has been passed down to us as essentially good. That puts him very much on the conservative side of the spectrum. And I don't mean that politically. What I mean is that he wants to conserve and preserve anything that is old, anything that works. He's very suspicious of anything that changes or upsets established norms. And there is some wisdom to that. We need to be willing to embrace the lessons of history. We need to be willing to learn from those who have gone before us. That's a really important thing. And we shouldn't be so arrogant to believe that we now see the world completely new and fresh and no one who's come before us has ever been as smart as we are. Now, at the same time, there are lots of things in the past that we should not be carrying forward. Slavery worked for most of human history. It allowed us to build societies, it allowed us to build economic models. It worked, but it was not good. It was unjust, it was evil. And rightfully, we left that behind. So even though we learn the lessons of the past, we do not do that uncritically. And that's something that I think we need to take into account when we're reading someone like Peterson. Second thing is he sees order and chaos as the fundamental forces in the world. And that each of us as individuals and as societies need to find a balance between them. So we might not need them in equal measure, but we need both of them in our world. And so navigating the world is about finding this balance between chaos or creativity and order and stability. And one of the things that people object to is he assigns these forces to genders. Feminine represents chaos, masculine represents order. And that is true if you're reading through ancient literature. Generally, masculine characters represent order, feminine characters represent chaos in the world. But he doesn't really read with a hermeneutic of suspicion here to realize that most of those stories are, of course, written by men who do have the power and do control the order and do have the strength in those societies. And so it's quite natural that the masculine characters would be put in those roles. And so I don't know that it's really helpful for us then necessarily to say that femininity, as it's expressed in our society today, is representative of chaos and masculinity, order, or strength. That is how it comes to us in the stories, but that may actually be representative of one of those things that we want to leave behind. Now, both of these ideas, an evolutionary framework for everything and order and chaos, leads Peterson to his sort of central advice that he wants to give in this book, which is essentially this. Pick yourself up off the couch, go outside, put your shoulders back, work hard, look people in the eye, and make something of yourself. And if you are a man, if you're a young man, if you're a young white man, this is probably actually some really good advice. There are a lot of us out there that need a figure in our lives who's telling us to get up off the couch, to put the video game controller down, to get over ourselves, to look people in the eye, to be confident, and to stop pitying ourselves and make the most out of our life. And I can really see why a lot of people, in particular young white men, are finding him very positive and very helpful in their lives, because that is really good advice for them. Now, the problem is that that works for a certain subset of the population who have the advantages, the privileges, and the opportunities that need to go along with that kind of an approach to life. The problem when I read Peterson is that there's not a lot of room in his writing, and maybe not in his worldview, for those who really are victims. Those who are at systemic injustices and systemic disadvantages, those who can't just go out and make something of their lives because society hasn't been set up for them. And so I can understand why a lot of people also read Peterson and say, you are not speaking to a real world. You are speaking to a very narrow slice of the world that happens to have a very big audience in the part of the world that you are writing to. But it's not actually representative of reality. And this is important, that when we read critically. And we realize that every writer is coming from a certain perspective, a certain view of the world. And if they are not critical of that, they are going to see the world only through their lens. I would argue that part of our role as Christians is actually to get outside of our lens, to get outside of our bubble, and to see things in new ways. And it's really important that as we read, we do that. You know, if there were an opening chapter in Peterson's book where he said, listen, I recognize that I'm writing to a particular audience who has privileges and advantages, and I'm trying to help them make the most of their life, I would actually probably endorse this book pretty uncritically, because I think it actually can be helpful. And most of his rules would actually be good rules for someone like me to follow. But when those ideas are projected onto other people all the time, uncritically, when I don't know their story, I don't know where they're coming from, I don't know their experience of the world, that's a real problem. And this is where I think Peterson really falls down, and it comes to when he starts to dabble in theology. Because Peterson will use the Bible liberally. And I don't mean in a liberal reading, I mean he uses it frequently. And what he will do, though, is treat the Bible as if it is part of this mono-myth that has been handed to us. So there are certain ways of approaching the world that have been codified and written down and preserved and passed down, and they represent the world around us, and he sees the Bible in that way. As I read him, I don't think that he actually believes in a God that is transcendent or objective. I think he sees being or God as this representative idea for how the world really works. And so there's this kind of strange partnership between conservative Christianity and Jordan Peterson that I see sometimes right now. People need to understand Peterson is not an orthodox conservative Christian in any real sense. And that's okay. That doesn't mean we can't learn from him. It just means let's be honest about where he's coming from. But he tends to use the Bibles in ways that really I would never see a biblical studies scholar or a theologian doing. And ultimately, that's because I would argue that the central story of the Bible leading to the death and resurrection of Christ is about inviting us into a willingness to move past our evolutionary programming. Evolution works. Survival of the fittest works. Competing with outsiders and strangers and scapegoating the other, that got us really far. In fact, it got us to a point of wealth and power and prestige in the world. But Christ comes into the story to say, just because it works doesn't mean it's good. And when we see that Christ comes and allows us to scapegoat him, allows us to direct our xenophobia and our violence and our hatred towards him, and then absorbs it, takes it into himself and forgives it, and allows us to be forgiven even in the midst of our worst tendencies, we are saved in part because our eyes are opened to see that what works only gets us so far. And it might be effective, but it's not good, and it's not beautiful, and it's not just, and it's not divine. And so in the story of Christ's death and resurrection, our eyes are opened, and we are saved, and we are forgiven, and we are opened up to a whole new imagination of the world where we can go and see things from someone else's perspective, where we are challenged to see things not only through the lens of our experience, but to see things through the lens of someone else. To know that there are people who experience the world differently than us. There are people who are wired differently than us. There are people who experience love and gender and religion and philosophy and economics. They experience the world in fundamentally different ways than we do. And when we have empathy, when we invite them into our circle so that we can learn from them, so that their story can become part of our story, then what happens is we actually see the world in a more true way. We see it from multiple perspectives. We see it the way that God sees it, not through one set of eyes, but through every set of eyes. God sees in 360 directions, and Christ invites us into that process as well. And so when someone comes along and wants to give advice, when I want to give advice, when Jordan Peterson wants to give advice, we have to earn the right to do that. And the way that we earn that right in the Christian community is to come alongside someone, to hear their story, to welcome their story, to begin to learn from their story, ultimately so that we can see through their story. Then we can share what we have learned about the world. And this is the really important thing when we're reading someone like Peterson. He's coming from his perspective, and there is some good in it. I don't think he's the devil. I think that he can be helpful for a certain set of people, but we have to make sure that we are always inviting new and varied perspectives. We need to learn from people of color. We need to learn from the LGBTQ community. We need to learn from theologians that see things differently from us. And as we put all that together, we are going to have a more complete, well-rounded, and actually accurate picture of what really is. Evolution, survival of the fittest, gets us somewhere. It doesn't get us to God. Grace and truth and peace and welcome and invitation and embrace, this is what helps us move from what works to what is good.